Chapter 3 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 7 by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 3, DuPont before Charleston. The blockade of the Atlantic coast was maintained with energy and efficiency. Many captures were made, and its execution was at all times so strict that no vessel could enter the Confederate harbors without imminent risk of capture or destruction, a condition of things which is generally accepted as the standard of efficiency in a blockade. Fast-sailing steamers, however, did often succeed in entering blockaded ports and in going out with cargoes of cotton, and the profits upon each trip were so enormous that the traffic continued throughout the war, the gains of success forming a sufficient insurance against probable losses. The Confederate government stoutly protested to foreign governments against the recognition of the blockade, continually asserting that it was inefficient and putting forth extraordinary efforts to break it. The most remarkable of these efforts was made by two Confederate ironclads in the harbor of Charleston, and was supplemented later in the same day by a proclamation of the Confederate commanders in that city; and it is hard to say which demonstration was the more audacious. The weather was most favorable to the sortie. A thick haze covered the glassy sea, and added to the obscurity of the wintry morning. Two of the strongest of the blockading vessels were absent for the moment, taking in coal at Port Royal. Only one vessel of any strength, the Housatonic, remained off the harbor with the Ottawa and Unadilla, and 7 other purchased vessels, which were no better fitted than North River steamboats to cope with ironclads. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the Confederate ram Palmetto State, followed by the Chicora, all at once loomed through the haze, almost touching the Mercedita, which was instantly disabled by the first shot from the ram, and an officer was too promptly sent on board the Confederate, who gave an irregular parole and returned to his vessel. The Keystone State was attacked by the Chicora and received considerable injury. Finding his ship helpless, her commander lowered his colors, but the Chicora, still continuing to fire, he thought better of it, hoisted them again, and with the assistance of the Memphis resumed the fight. By this time the Housatonic had got under way, and, steering in as near as soundings would permit, opened fire on the rams and soon drove them back to the protection of the forts. The Mercedita patched up her injuries and steamed without assistance for Port Royal, whither the Keystone State was also sent for repairs, so that before 10 o'clock in the morning the incident was closed and the blockade was reestablished. The rams had made a bold and, on the whole, not unsuccessful raid, but the performance of General Beauregard and Commodore Ingram, commanding respectively the military and naval forces in South Carolina, was still more daring, and their raid upon paper left entirely out of sight that of the Palmetto State and the Chicora on the still waters of the harbor. These enthusiastic officers trumpeted to the world the following proclamation: "At about 5 o'clock this morning, the Confederate States naval force on this station attacked the United States blockading fleet off the harbor of the city of Charleston, and sunk, dispersed, or drove off, and out of sight for the time, the entire hostile fleet. Therefore we, the undersigned commanders, respectively, of the Confederate States naval and land forces in this quarter, do hereby formally declare the blockade by the United States of the said city of Charleston, South Carolina, to be raised by a superior force of the Confederate States, from and after this 31st day of January, A.D. 1863. This swelling manifesto was based not upon any possible facts, but upon diligent reading of works of international law. General Beauregard knew that a blockade did not become ineffective through the momentary and accidental dispersion of the blockading fleet, but only through the action of a superior hostile force, and he made his proclamation to fit the law rather than the facts. The Charleston papers stated, in addition to this official utterance, that the French and Spanish consuls, at the invitation of General Beauregard, had gone out in a Confederate steamer, and that the British consul, with the commander of the British war steamer Petrel, had sailed 5 miles beyond the usual anchorage of the blockaders, and that no signs of the Federal force were visible, that the foreign consuls had held a meeting and were unanimously of the opinion that the blockade was legally raised. There was a good deal of loose and exaggerated statement on both sides during the war, but it may be questioned if anything else so false or so reckless as this proceeded from any source from the beginning to the end of hostilities. No vessels were sunk, none were set on fire seriously, only the Mercedita and the Keystone State were injured, and their injuries were soon repaired. The engagement was so soon at an end that many of the vessels of the fleet knew nothing of it until all was over. The Housatonic was never beyond the usual line of blockade. No attempt was made to run the blockade that day. 5 officers of the highest character commanding vessels nearest to the action testified that no vessels came out from Charleston to make the pretended inspection set forth in the Confederate accounts, and yet this statement, founded only upon the fact that the rams went out and had a skirmish and were driven back, was heralded to the world and accepted by everyone who sympathized with the Confederates, and for a time cast a serious doubt upon the efficiency of the blockade. By way of testing the ironclads of the Monitor type, Admiral Dupont, in the latter part of January, had sent the Montauk to attack the Confederate works at Genesis Point, about 15 miles south of Savannah, afterwards known as Fort McAllister, and the scene of several serious engagements, and, if possible, to capture or destroy the Nashville, a swift blockade runner, which, failing to escape with a cargo of cotton, had been withdrawn, her cargo removed, and the vessel fitted out as a privateer. Under the protection of Fort McAllister, she had lain in the Ogeechee River for several months, waiting for an opportunity to emerge. Worden, whose gallantry and intelligence had already been shown in the combat with the Merrimac, attacked the fort on the 27th of January and again on the 1st of February, but inflicted no damage upon it which could not be readily repaired. The fort poured volley after volley upon the Montauk with very little effect. Had the fort been the only enemy in sight, the Montauk would have at once proceeded up the river, but the stream was heavily obstructed and planted with a line of torpedoes. On the 27th of February, Worden observed the Nashville with steam up and apparently in trouble, and after a bold yet careful reconnaissance he discovered that she was aground about 1,200 yards above the obstructions. With a true sailor's intuition, he saw that his prey was within his reach. She had grounded at high water and could not get off before morning. He, therefore, resolved at the earliest light to push into the area swept by McAllister's fire and destroy the privateer at his leisure. This daring but sagacious plan was carried out at daylight the next morning. Deliberately placing himself under the guns of McAllister, he opened fire upon the Nashville across a low projection of swampy land, at the point of which lay the line of obstructions. The upper works of the privateer alone were in sight across the low land, but Worden, undisturbed by the tempest of shot and shell which rained on him from the fort, speedily got the range of the Nashville and dropped his 11 and 15-inch shells with terrible precision upon the Confederate vessel, and in a few moments saw the flames rising from her above the swamp. Through the thick fog which now settled down over both combatants, hiding them from each other's view, Worden continued his deadly fire, his mathematics taking the place of eyesight. All his available men stood by to repel boarders who were expected every moment through the fog, but none came, and when the mist disappeared in the morning sun, the Nashville was seen to be on fire from stem to stern. Her pivot gun burst. A few minutes later her smoke stack went by the board, and at last, with a loud detonation, the magazine exploded, scattering the blackened timbers over the river and swamp. The furious and inaccurate fire of McAllister had done little or no damage to the Montauk, one of the most brilliant and scientific exploits of the Navy during the war had been gained almost without cost. 3 days later, Admiral Dupont, as a matter of experiment and practice, ordered the Passaic, Patapsco, and the Nahant to make a new attack upon Fort McAllister, which was energetically done. The engagement was interesting as a matter of target practice, but without substantial results on either side. On account of the obstructions and the depth of water, vessels could not approach nearer than 1,200 yards, and although this had not been too great a distance for the Montauk to destroy the Nashville, it was entirely too far for anything afloat to destroy an earthwork like McAllister. 2 of the guns of the fort were disabled, the parapet and traverses were badly knocked about, but no damage was done which could not be repaired in a few hours. The vessels returned substantially unhurt to Port Royal harbor. A formidable force of ironclads had been collected under the command of Rear Admiral Dupont by the beginning of April, 1863. The officers and crews had become sufficiently acquainted with their construction and disciplined in their workings. They had been tested by the incidents we have described and by a large number of reconnaissances in the various rivers, bays, and inlets which formed the network of the sea islands. The admiral now prepared, under orders from Washington, to assault, with his entire ironclad fleet, Fort Sumter and the other defenses of Charleston, and high hopes were entertained, both in the fleet and at Washington, of the capture of the city of Charleston. Although the officers of the Navy had already conceived a prejudice against the Monitor class of vessels, which afterwards developed into vehement hostility, and although life below the surface of the waves was almost intolerable in these iron chests, it was with a feeling of hope and elation that this extensive attack was planned and begun. When at noon on the 7th of April the great flotilla moved in the order of battle, which sailors call line ahead, under the lead of Captain John Rodgers in the Weehawken, there was little doubt in the minds of the accomplished officers commanding the ironclads that they could silence the batteries on either side and pound Fort Sumter into brick dust before the sun should set. There was great excitement also in the Confederate camp. For the past 2 months General Beauregard had been in constant expectation of a serious attack. On the 8th of February he telegraphed the governor of South Carolina, saying that an attack would soon be made by an overwhelming force, and that not much assistance could be expected from the Confederate government. General Lee wrote to Jefferson Davis in the same sense, saying also that he expected an advance on the part of General Hooker, but adding, "The troops of this army are ready to move at a moment's warning, and all I require is notice where they are wanted." And 12 days later Beauregard issued a stirring proclamation, couched in the grandiloquent terms characteristic of him, urging non-combatants to retire at once from Charleston and Savannah, and ending with this clamorous appeal: "Carolinians and Georgians, the hour is at hand to prove your devotion to your country's cause. Let all able-bodied men from the seaboard to the mountains rush to arms. Be not exacting in the choice of weapons. Pikes and scythes will do for exterminating your enemies, spades and shovels for protecting your friends." The governor the next day called out the militia, saying, "The abolitionists are threatening to invade our soil with a formidable army, and the most effective method of defending our firesides, our wives, and our children is to meet the ruthless invader at the threshold." General Beauregard remained in this nervous state during the 2 months that intervened before the attack. He was continually writing to Richmond in regard to the overwhelming land forces of the enemy, striving, like some of the Federal generals, to put the Government in the wrong in case of a defeat, and to secure for himself all the credit in case of victory. He claimed that Hunter's force was 40,000, while his own was only 25,000. Writing to Mr. Memminger on the 28th of March, he said that he needed 3 more brigades of troops, but he hoped, "If we are not successful, while the country may deplore, it will have no just cause to blush for our defeat." His apprehensions reached their climax when the ironclads appeared off Charleston harbor, and he then issued orders to Captain Francis D. Lee to make all necessary arrangements for the destruction of the torpedo ram under his charge at a moment's warning. He understated his own force and greatly overestimated that of his enemy. His returns for the 7th of April showed an effective total of 32,217 men, his aggregate present and absent being 43,449, not counting 3,000 negroes at work on the fortifications, while Hunter's returns show about 20,000 present for duty, with an aggregate present and absent of 27,060. The 9 floating forts composing the flotilla embodied the best results of labor, invention, and discipline of which the Navy was capable. It was Admiral Dupont's intention, keeping the batteries on Sullivan's Island to his right, to move up the channel between Fort Moultrie and Fort Sumter and establish himself to the northwest of the latter work, to reduce it by the fire of the monitors, and thence to gather the fruits of victory at the wharves of Charleston. But the result was one of the most complete failures of the war. In spite of the lavish expense, the long preparation, and the gallantry and obstinacy with which the attack was made, the monitors met with a severe repulse, and although few lives were lost, the victory of the Confederates was to them one of the most valuable and inspiriting which they ever gained. The attack, that was to have begun at noon on the 7th of April, was, as usual, delayed by trivial accidents for over an hour, and after the vessels got under way, their imperfect steering qualities caused the line of battle to be continually disarranged, and it was nearly 3 o'clock when the Weehawken received the first furious volleys from Moultrie and Sumter and all the subsidiary batteries within range. Rodgers replied with his usual energy and spirit. In spite of the rain of iron from the forts, he worked his guns as rapidly as possible, firing 26 heavy shells from the Weehawken, which in turn was struck 53 times in 40 minutes, receiving considerable injuries but not becoming disabled. He approached very near the obstructions which extended from Fort Sumter to Fort Moultrie, and found the casks by which they were buoyed and marked so thickly dotting the waters, and with an appearance so formidable, that he thought best not to push his vessel further upon such certain perils and probable disaster. As the Weehawken turned, a torpedo exploded under her, but did no harm. The other vessels, as they came within range of the Confederate batteries, had much the same experience. The Passaic was struck 35 times. The Montauk received 14 shots without especial injury. The Catskill, approaching within 600 yards of Sumter, met a heavy crossfire, receiving 20 missiles. The Nantucket was struck 51 times, and the Nahant 36 times. The Keokuk, finding itself in danger of running foul of the Nahant in the narrow channel and the rushing tide, took a position a little in advance of the line, and between the fire of Moultrie and Sumter she was struck 90 times, 19 shots piercing her about the water line. After more than an hour of this frightful punishment, she was withdrawn and anchored out of range of the enemy's fire, and kept afloat during the night. But at 7 o'clock the next morning she rapidly filled and sank, her crew and wounded having been removed just in time to save their lives. Admiral Dupont was unable to bring his own flagship, the New Ironsides, into the thick of the fight, as he desired and endeavored to do. The vessel was almost unmanageable in the narrow channel and the swift current, and had to be anchored twice to prevent grounding. She came no nearer to Fort Sumter at any time than 1,000 yards. In the course of her movements she floated for an hour over a cylinder torpedo of the enemy containing 2,000 pounds of powder, at first to the delight, but finally to the exasperation of the Confederate engineer, who tried in vain to explode it. Near 5 o'clock the admiral, finding that it was too late to fight the battle before dark, gave signal for his vessels to withdraw, expecting to renew the attack the next morning. But, as the commanders of the ironclads reported, one by one, on board the flagship with their stories of injury to their vessels, stories in which there was perhaps something of unintentional exaggeration, natural to men who had been confined during the afternoon in such abnormal conditions under water, exposed every instant to the danger of death by drowning, by cannon shot, by flying splinters and broken plates and bolts, the admiral became convinced of the uselessness of any further attempt to force the passage of the forts, and concluded to renounce his intention of renewing the attack. He briefly announced this conclusion to the department, and in a later and more detailed report of April 15 he described the fire to which his vessels were subjected and the injury resulting from it, and gave it as his opinion that any attempt to pass through the obstructions would have entangled the vessels and held them under the most severe fire of heavy ordnance that had ever been delivered. "I had hoped," he said, "that the endurance of the ironclads would have enabled them to have borne any weight of fire to which they might have been exposed; but when I found that so large a portion of them were wholly or one half disabled by less than an hour's engagement before attempting to overcome the obstructions, or testing the power of the torpedoes, I was convinced that persistence in the attack would only result in the loss of the greater portion of the ironclad fleet, and in leaving many of them inside the harbor to fall into the hands of the enemy. The latter contingency would have been a serious disaster, and might have resulted in the breaking of the blockade." On the same evening Admiral Dupont received a confidential letter from the Secretary of the Navy, dated April 2, saying, "The exigencies of the public service are so pressing in the Gulf that the department directs you to send all the ironclads that are in a fit condition to move, after your present attack upon Charleston, directly to New Orleans, reserving to yourself only 2. This order was accompanied by an unofficial letter from Mr. Fox, saying that matters were at a standstill, on the Mississippi River, and that the President had been, with difficulty, restrained from sending off Hunter and all the ironclads directly to New Orleans, the opening of the Mississippi being now the principal object of the Government. He says we must abandon all other operations on the coast, where ironclads are necessary, to a future time. We cannot clear the Mississippi River without the ironclads, and as all the supplies come down the Red River, that stretch of the river must be in our possession. This plan has been agreed upon after mature consideration and seems to be imperative. While the mind of the admiral was under the influence of the failure of the attack and of these dispatches, General Hunter, commanding the land forces, made a proposition that the army and navy should join in an attack on the works on Morris Island, which proposition the admiral declined. Answering a letter full of compliment and sympathy from General Hunter, the admiral said, "I feel very comfortable, General, for the reason that a merciful Providence permitted me to have a failure instead of a disaster, and if I had ever entertained for a moment any misgiving as to my course, the dispatches just handed me would remove it." The day before, April 8, finding the ships more damaged than he had suspected, he had written to General Hunter, "I am now satisfied that the place cannot be taken by a purely naval attack, and I am admonished by the condition of the ironclads that a persistence in our efforts would end in disaster, and might cause us to leave some of our ironclads in the hands of the enemy, which would render it difficult for us to hold those parts of the coast which are now in our possession. I have therefore determined to withdraw my vessels." The failure of the naval attack on Charleston caused a disappointment in the North in proportion to the high hopes which had been entertained of a brilliant success. On the 11th of April, before the news had reached Washington, the Secretary of the Navy wrote to DuPont that the President had suggested that in view of operations elsewhere, and especially by the Army of the Potomac, it would be best for the admiral to retain a strong force off Charleston, even if he should find it impossible to carry the place. He therefore ordered him to continue to menace the rebels, keeping them in apprehension of a renewed attack, in order that they might be occupied, and not come north or go west to the aid of those with whom our forces were expecting to be immediately engaged. "Should you be successful," added the Secretary, "as we trust and believe you will be, it is expected that General Hunter will continue to keep the rebels employed and in constant apprehension, so that they shall not leave the vicinity of Charleston. This detention of ironclads, should it be necessary in consequence of a repulse, can be but for a few days. I trust your success will be such that the ironclads can be, or will have been, dispatched to the Gulf when this reaches you." This dispatch, which counted so confidently upon his success, was bitter reading to the admiral after his failure. A day or two later he received a dispatch directly from the President, dated the 13th of April. "Hold your position inside the bar near Charleston, or if you shall have left it, return to it and hold it till further orders. Do not allow the enemy to erect new batteries or defenses on Morris Island. If he has begun it, drive him out. I do not herein order you to renew the general attack. That is to depend on your own discretion or a further order." And the next day, conscious of a certain inconsistency between this order and that of April 2, the President issued a joint instruction to General Hunter and Admiral DuPont, directing him who received it first to communicate it instantly to the other. Executive Mansion, April 14, 1863. This is intended to clear up an apparent inconsistency between the recent order to continue operations before Charleston and the former one to remove to another point in a certain contingency. No censure upon you or either of you is intended. We still hope that by cordial and judicious cooperation you can take the batteries on Morris Island and Sullivan's Island and Fort Sumter. But whether you can or not, we wish the demonstration kept up for a time for a collateral and very important object. We wish the attempt to be a real one, though not a desperate one, if it affords any considerable chance of success. But if prosecuted as a demonstration only, this must not become public, or the whole effect will be lost. Once again, before Charleston, do not leave till further orders from here. Of course, this is not intended to force you to leave unduly exposed Hilton Head or other near points in your charge. Yours truly, A. Lincoln. On receipt of these dispatches, the mortification and resentment of Admiral Dupont were greatly increased. He fancied, entirely without reason, that the President's orders were couched in a tone of censure and criticism, and wrote on the 16th to the Secretary of the Navy, requesting that the Department would relieve him by appointing an officer who, in its opinion, is more able to execute that service in which I have had the misfortune to fail, the capture of Charleston. He announced his intention to obey all orders with the utmost fidelity, even when his judgment was entirely at variance with them, such as the order to reoccupy the unsafe anchorage for the ironclads off Morris Island, and an intimation that a renewal of the attack on Charleston might be ordered, which, he added, in my judgment would be attended with disastrous results involving the loss of this coast. In the same tone of resentful subordination, he said, I shall spare no exertions in repairing as soon as possible the serious injury sustained by the monitors in the late attack, and shall get them inside Charleston Bar with all dispatch in accordance with the order of the President. I think it my duty, however, to state to the Department that this will be attended with great risk to these vessels from the gales which prevail at this season, and from the continuous fire of the enemy's batteries, which they can neither silence nor prevent the erection of new ones. In this opinion the admiral was supported by the leading officers of his fleet. It was the general belief in the blockading squadron that the monitors could not ride securely at anchor within the bar. The opinion, however, was erroneous, as was afterwards frankly admitted by the same officers. The bar was found to furnish a sufficient protection from the heavy seas to the vessels inside, and the monitors rode safely at anchor off Charleston inside the bar for nearly 2 years. They were made safe by heavy moorings with buoys attached, and the dragging, so confidently predicted by Dupont, never took place. The monitor vessels did most important service at a critical time, and their short history will render still more illustrious the name of their accomplished inventor. But there existed against them among the higher officers of the Navy an unconquerable repugnance. This arose partly from the disagreeable conditions of existence in the monitors in the southern seas. The temperature below decks, when the hatches were closed, became almost intolerable in the course of a few hours, and the perils of battle were doubled by those of asphyxia to officers and men laboring in intense activity and excitement in the vitiated air. The dangers which a trained soldier or sailor accustoms himself to accept with coolness in the wonted conditions of field or siege, or on the open deck, became much more exasperating to the nerves when, to a man shut up in an iron room, every inch of the wall was charged with possible death. The officers in the turrets were constantly exposed to destruction from the flying of nuts within, answering to the impact of projectiles without. Many a tired officer, leaning for a moment's rest against the wall of his protecting dungeon, was disabled by the shock of a shell outside that never touched him. The slow movement of the vessels in action, a fault which was rapidly and constantly aggravated by the extraordinary growth of seaweed and shellfish on their bottoms in the warm southern waters, their incurable habit of sheering from one side to the other when not under way, all induced the officers whose education and training had been obtained in swift-sailing clippers on the deep seas to regard the monitors with feelings of disgust, which rendered them perhaps unjust to their great and incontestable merits. 5 of the officers of highest rank near Charleston, a month after the failure of the attack on Sumter, submitted an opinion to the Navy Department which condemned the monitors in the strongest language. They regarded them as incapable of keeping the seas and of making long voyages. Though in a secure harbor and able to choose their time of exit, it was admitted they could greatly damage and harass a blockading force. The long time required to load, point, and fire the heavy guns, which they placed at 7 minutes, was another objection. The Navy Department, however, did not accept this report as conclusive against the monitors, and they continued to render good service until the close of the war. Perhaps no more striking proof of the excellent qualities of the monitors and of their serious structural defects was ever given than in the splendid achievement of the Weehawken on the 17th of June and her inglorious end the following winter. All through the early part of the month of June, rumors were continually reaching Admiral Dupont that the Confederate ironclads at Savannah were about to leave by way of the Wilmington River for the purpose of raising the blockade of Warsaw Sound and the neighboring inlets. The principal ironclad at that place, and one of the most formidable war vessels ever constructed by the Confederacy, was the ram Atlanta. This was originally an English iron steamer called the Fingal, which, after a successful career as a blockade runner, had been taken by the Confederate Government, rechristened the Atlanta, and altered into a man of war. Her deck had been cut down to within about 2 feet of the water. This was surmounted by a casemate with inclined sides and flat roof, enclosing a powerful battery of 4 Brooke rifles of 6 and 7-inch caliber, 2 of which could be fired either laterally or fore and aft. Her armor was 4 inches thick, of double 2-inch plates of English railroad iron. The edges of the deck projected 6 feet from the side of the vessel, the overhang being filled in and strengthened with a heavy mass of wood and iron. These details were, of course, unknown to Admiral Dupont, but knowledge of the great strength of the vessel and the high hopes entertained of her in the South had come to him, and he therefore dispatched to Warsaw Sound to guard against her 2 of his best monitors, the Weehawken and the Nahant, under the command respectively of 2 of the most trustworthy and accomplished officers in the fleet, Captain John Rogers and Commander John Downes. As soon as the monitors appeared, the officers of the Atlanta joyfully accepted the gage of battle thus held out to them, and early on the morning of the 17th of June she came down the river, accompanied by several steamers, decorated with holiday flags and loaded with spectators who had thronged from the city to witness the easy defeat and probable destruction or capture of the Yankee flotilla. There may have been more of confidence and of ardor on board the Atlanta than within the black turrets of the Federal ironclads, but there never were seen afloat or ashore more of coolness, courage, and trained scientific presence of mind than Captain Rogers brought to the important work before him. At the first sight of his enemy, he beat to quarters and cleared his ship for action. Then, slipping their cables, the Weehawken and the Nahant steamed outward for the northeast end of Warsaw Island. The movement was interpreted on board the Atlanta as one of retreat. The Federal commanders, having finished their preparations, turned and stood up the Sound to meet their confident adversary. The Atlanta fired first at a distance of 1.5 miles. The shot, which went over the stern of the Weehawken, struck the water near the Nahant. For 20 minutes the monitors advanced slowly and steadily, and in perfect silence, until Rogers, who was in the lead and whose plan had been thoroughly arranged in advance, attained the point he had selected for beginning his attack, 300 yards from the Confederate ram. As coolly and deliberately as if he were engaged at target practice, he opened fire with his 15-inch gun. The result of his first shot on the Atlanta was simply stupefying. Although it was fired at an angle of 50 degrees with the keel striking the sloping side of the vessel in the line of her ports, it penetrated her armor, ripped out the wooden backing, covering the deck with splinters of iron and Georgia pine, and prostrated about 40 men. The second shot struck the edge of her projection, starting some plates. The third took off the roof of the pilot house, injuring both pilots and knocking senseless the man at the wheel. One more shot came, thundering ruin and doom, breaking a port shutter and driving the crumbled fragments in through the port. This was all the work of a few minutes. The Atlanta fired only one shell at long range before the Weehawken opened. The consternation of these appalling blows following in such rapid succession, far more than the real injury received, had rendered the officers and crew incapable of further fighting. She hauled down her colors, hoisting the white flag in token of surrender. The Weehawken had captured the greatest naval prize of the war with 4 shots in 15 minutes, and the gallant Downes in the Nahant had had no need or opportunity to assist. The Atlanta was found to be so little hurt that in a few hours she steamed without assistance to Port Royal. There were only 16 Confederates wounded. Not a man was touched on board the Weehawken. Yet this famous vessel, which made such easy work of any enemy opposed to her, perished at last by the faults of her own construction. She lay at anchor on the 6th of December, 1863, within Charleston bar, fast to one of the mooring buoys. She had been heavily loaded with shells, and the weight caused her to lie deeper than usual in the water. The sea was rather heavy, and a considerable amount of water slopped into the windlass room unnoticed through her hawse holes. As the sea became heavier, the waves began washing over the bow and came over the high combing of the hatchway. To keep the water out of the cabin, the iron door between it and the windlass room was closed, and as the seas increased, while closing down the battle plate of the hatchway, several seas went over, almost filling the room. The pumps were put to work, and at first the executive officer had no apprehension of the loss of the vessel. Shortly after noon it was found that the Weehawken was sinking. The signal was made that assistance was required, but it was too late. 5 minutes afterwards the vessel heeled to starboard, the bow settled, and suddenly righting herself, she went down, the top of her smokestack alone remaining visible. 4 officers and 20 men were drowned. For some time after the 7th of April, General Beauregard was unable to realize the full extent of the repulse he had inflicted upon the national forces. He remained in constant expectation of a renewal of the attack, and busied himself in plans for offensive returns which never were carried out. On the 11th of April he issued orders for a general boarding assault from the boats in Charleston harbor upon the Federal fleet. In his instructions to the officer charged with the work, he says, "I feel convinced that with nerve and proper precaution on the part of your boat's crews, and with the protection of a kind Providence, not one of the enemy's monsters, so much boasted of by them, would live to see the next morning's sun." He was so sure of great results from this plan that he indiscreetly boasted of them in advance by telegraph to the South Carolina senators at Richmond. "I have advised," he says, "a secret expedition which will shake abolitiondom to its foundation if successful. My hopes are strong." But nothing came of it. and in view of the continued inactivity of the national forces on the coast, the Confederate Government, feeling the absolute necessity of giving every possible support to Lee in the east and Pemberton in the west, withdrew from Beauregard early in May a part of his force. This extorted from him loud outcry and clamor, in which the representatives of South Carolina at Richmond joined. Mr. Seddon, the Confederate Secretary of War, upon whom devolved the hard task of fighting at the same time the Federal armies and the Confederate jealousies, tried his best to satisfy the South Carolinians of the unreasonableness of their remonstrances. "The enemy cannot have," he said, "more than 10,000 or 15,000 troops at the utmost. After all deductions for the troops sent back to North Carolina and ordered to Mississippi, there would be left for the defense of Charleston and Savannah more than 15,000 of all arms. Surely with this force you can be in no serious danger, considering the superiority of spirit and valor in your soldiers and the advantages of entrenchments from a force probably not equal, certainly not superior, of the Yankee enemy." This statement, reserving the natural Southern boast, was as accurate as it was reasonable. Hunter had 15,745 effectives, as shown by his May returns, while Beauregard's effective force after the withdrawal of the troops mentioned still amounted to 20,045. Mr. Seddon went on to say, "I could be scarcely justified in stating the causes that preclude succor from General Lee's army and other points to General Pemberton, but you may rely upon it that only on the fullest consideration and under the gravest necessity is the draft made on Charleston and persisted in, despite the earnest remonstrance of gentlemen so highly esteemed as yourselves." The campaign of Gettysburg was at that moment in preparation in Richmond, and the capture of Philadelphia and Washington was the dream which occupied the minds of the Confederate Government on one hand, while on the other the resistless march of Grant's legions across Mississippi was straining their utmost energies. But no considerations of reason or policy had any effect to quiet the petulant complaints of General Beauregard. While demanding the impossible from his government, he writes, with singular self-deception, to the South Carolina senators, "All I ask is not to be cramped, decried, or unnecessarily driven into opposition to the government, where a united front and the concentrated efforts of all are absolutely required to withstand the gigantic storm which threatens to engulf us at any moment. I am well aware that, like others, I have my faults and my deficiencies, but, thank God, selfishness and ambition form no part of my nature." It was not the fault of General Hunter that Beauregard was left so completely at leisure from April to June. On the very afternoon of the ironclad attack on Fort Sumter, he had massed his troops on Folly Island, ready to cross Lighthouse Inlet and attack the Confederate positions on Morris Island. The boats were ready, the men under arms for crossing, when they were recalled by the announcement of Admiral Dupont that he had resolved to retire. On the 29th of April, Hunter proposed to the admiral a general demonstration on the Savannah River, which Dupont declined, saying that nothing but a feint could be made, and that would be regarded as a repulse by the rebels as well as in the North. Hunter, at last being satisfied that the rebels had already sent away from Charleston and Savannah all the troops not absolutely needed to garrison the defenses, therefore begged to be relieved from his orders to cooperate with the navy, in which case he promised to place a column of 10,000 of the best drilled soldiers in the country at once in the heart of Georgia. "Nothing is truer," he says, "than that this rebellion has left the Southern States a mere hollow shell." He promised with this column to penetrate into Georgia, produce a practical dissolution of the slave system there, destroy all railroad communication along the eastern portion of the State, and lay waste all stores which can possibly be used for the sustenance of the rebellion. But even while the ardent veteran was thus begging for a dissolution of the partnership which bound him to the admiral, the removal both of himself and Dupont from command had already been determined upon at Washington. Admiral Foote had been designated to relieve Dupont. He dying on the 26th of June, Admiral Dahlgren was appointed in his place, while General Q. A. Gillmore, a brilliant and energetic young officer of engineers, was on the 3rd of June appointed to relieve General Hunter in the command of the Department of the South. The President, on the 30th of June, wrote to General Hunter, "I assure you, and you may feel authorized in stating, that the recent change of commanders in the Department of the South was made for no reasons which convey any imputation upon your known energy, efficiency, and patriotism, but for causes which seemed sufficient, while they were in no degree incompatible with the respect and esteem in which I have always held you as a man and an officer." The Secretary of the Navy at the same time sent an equally cordial and complimentary letter to Admiral Dupont, commending the ceaseless vigilance which had ended in the destruction of the Nashville, and the timely measures to which were due the capture of the Atlanta. "You may well regard this," he says, "and we may with pleasure look upon it, as a brilliant termination of a command gallantly commenced and conducted for nearly 2 years with industry, energy, and ability." End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 7, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 4, Chancellorsville. The President did not leave General Hooker in ignorance of any of his sentiments towards him. On the day that he appointed him commander of the Army of the Potomac, he wrote him the following letter, which is equally remarkable for its frankness and its magnanimity. "I have placed you at the head of the Army of the Potomac. Of course I have done this upon what appears to me to be sufficient reasons, and yet I think it best for you to know that there are some things in regard to which I am not quite satisfied with you. I believe you to be a brave and skillful soldier, which of course I like. I also believe you do not mix politics with your profession, in which you are right. You have confidence in yourself, which is a valuable, if not an indispensable quality. You are ambitious, which within reasonable bounds does good rather than harm, but I think that during General Burnside's command of the army you have taken counsel of your ambition and thwarted him as much as you could, in which you did a great wrong to the country and to a most meritorious and honorable brother officer. I have heard in such a way as to believe it of your recently saying that both the army and the government needed a dictator. Of course it was not for this, but in spite of it, that I have given you the command. Only those generals who gain successes can set up dictators. What I now ask of you is military success, and I will risk the dictatorship. The government will support you to the utmost of its ability, which is neither more nor less than it has done and will do for all commanders. I much fear that the spirit which you have aided to infuse into the army, of criticizing their commander and withholding confidence from him, will now turn upon you. I shall assist you as far as I can to put it down. Neither you nor Napoleon, if he were alive again, could get any good out of an army while such a spirit prevails in it. And now beware of rashness, but with energy and sleepless vigilance go forward and give us victories." A friend to whom Hooker showed this letter immediately upon its reception says it made a deep impression upon the general. While he was somewhat chagrined by its severe chiding, he was touched by its tone of mingled authority and kindness. "He talks to me like a father," the general said. "I shall not answer this letter until I have won him a great victory." He immediately went about his work in the most faithful and efficient manner. The spirit of gloom and demoralization, which other observers had noticed in the Army of the Potomac, became more evident to him, now that he had command of the whole army, than it had been while he commanded one of the grand divisions. Desertions, he says, were at the rate of about 200 a day. A large number of the officers were openly hostile to the policy of the government. There was a spirit of dormant revolt which began to show itself after the proclamation of emancipation. General Hooker felt that the first thing to be done was to check desertion and to renew as far as possible the morale of the army. He found absent from their command some 3,000 officers and 80,000 privates. By a judicious system of punishment and of furloughs, he corrected this evil to a great extent. He reorganized his staff departments to occupy the troops who were rusting in idleness. He greatly increased the amount of drill and field exercise. He consolidated the cavalry and improved its efficiency. By frequent small expeditions and skirmishes, he brought up the spirit and discipline of this arm to a higher point than it had before reached. In the early part of April, he was able to say that he had under his command a living army, and one well worthy of the Republic. On one occasion, he called it the finest army on the planet. This necessary and valuable work occupied him during 3 months of the late winter and early spring. About the middle of April he felt that an active movement was required. The troops were ready for it, and public opinion demanded it. He had an army of about 130,000 men, effective for service. That of General Lee on the opposite side of the river had been reduced by Longstreet's departure for the South to not less than 60,000. Hooker was confident of success, perhaps too confident. He wrote to the President on the 11th, announcing his intended movement and saying, "I am apprehensive that he, the enemy, will retire from before me the moment I should succeed in crossing the river and over the shortest line to Richmond, and thus escape being seriously crippled." He hoped, however, to delay and check him with cavalry, and thus get a fight out of him. The President on the same day made the following memorandum, showing his clear perception of the immediate work in hand. "My opinion is that just now, with the enemy directly ahead of us, there is no eligible route for us into Richmond, and consequently a question of preference between the Rappahannock route and the James River route is a contest about nothing. Hence our prime object is the enemy's army in front of us, and is not with or about Richmond at all, unless it be incidental to the main object. What then? The two armies are face to face with a narrow river between them. Our communications are shorter and safer than are those of the enemy. For this reason we can with equal powers fret him more than he can us. I do not think that by raids towards Washington he can derange the Army of the Potomac at all. He has no distant operations which can call any of the Army of the Potomac away. We have such operations which may call him away, at least in part. While he remains intact, I do not think we should take the disadvantage of attacking him in his entrenchments, but we should continually harass and menace him, so that he shall have no leisure nor safety in sending away detachments. If he weakens himself, then pitch into him." The plan of campaign which Hooker adopted was simple, bold, and perfectly practicable. The failure of Burnside had eliminated several elements from the problem. There were no practicable fords below Fredericksburg, and none above Fredericksburg as far as the mouth of the Rapidan. Hooker, writing to a friend about this time, said, "You must be patient with me. Remember that my army is at the bottom of a well, and the enemy holds the top." There were many points where crossing of the river was possible, but it was almost hopeless to think of gaining a footing on the hills beyond, exposed as the troops would be for a long distance to a concentrated artillery fire. The first place above the city where favorable conditions of approach were to be found was Banks's Ford, about 6 miles by the road. This was heavily fortified. Two of the enemy's lines were so close to each other that both could bring their fire at once upon troops crossing the river. About 7 miles further there was another practicable approach to the stream, the United States Mine Ford, also strongly fortified with long lines of infantry parapets. The enemy had not thought it worth while to expend much labor on the Rappahannock above the mouth of the Rapidan, an attack involving so great a detour, and the crossing of two difficult rivers seemed to him so improbable that he took no measures to prevent it. It was this route, therefore, that Hooker wisely chose. He resolved to threaten the enemy's right wing by a heavy demonstration under General John Sedgwick, with 3 corps a few miles below Fredericksburg, while he threw a strong force across the Rappahannock at Kelly's Ford and essayed by a rapid march down the Rappahannock to knock away the enemy's force holding the United States and Banks's fords by attacking them in rear. And as soon as these fords were reopened, to reinforce the marching columns sufficiently for them to attack and rout the rebel army wherever they should meet it outside of its works. He had intended to anticipate this movement of his infantry by a great cavalry raid through Virginia. He gave orders to General Stoneman on the 12th of April to take his entire cavalry force, to turn the enemy's position on his left, to throw a force between him and Richmond, cutting off his supplies, intercepting his retreat, and injuring him in every way possible, and enjoined upon him the utmost vigilance and energy. Let your watchword be fight, and let all your orders be fight, fight, fight. In pursuance of these orders, the cavalry left their camps the next day, but on the second day out a great rainstorm came on. The river became impassable, and every ravine turned to a foaming torrent. The expedition was therefore compelled to wait. A start was made on the 28th, and on the 29th the cavalry corps crossed the Rappahannock. The infantry movement was executed with astonishing celerity and success. The general had kept secret from his corps commanders the details of his plan. 3 corps were put in motion on the 27th of April. By a rapid march on the 28th, they crossed the Rappahannock on a canvas pontoon bridge, finding nothing but a small picket to oppose them. They crossed the Rapidan on the morning of the 30th. Lee, whose attention had been diverted by the noisy demonstration which Sedgwick was making below the river, knew nothing of the more formidable enemy approaching on his left. The army coming down the right bank of the Rappahannock uncovered the United States ford, as Hooker had anticipated, and the engineers rapidly bridged the Rappahannock at that point. So far the march of Hooker had been one of the most successful made in the war. The rebel general was completely deceived. When he heard of the turning column on the Rappahannock, he imagined it was on the way to Gordonsville, and he sent his cavalry upon that track, and therefore lost the use of it for 24 hours. If Hooker had continued his march with the same success and swiftness with which it was begun, it is hard to see how Lee could have escaped a crushing defeat. On the evening of the 30th, Hooker had 4 corps at Chancellorsville, 3 roads run from there to Fredericksburg, on the right a plank road, on the left a road skirting the river, and between them a road called the Old Turnpike. Here he wasted the greater part of an afternoon and a morning, hours of inestimable importance. It was 11 o'clock on the 1st of May when General Hooker began his direct movement upon the enemy's rear. Slocum's corps, followed by that of Howard, had the extreme right. Sykes and Hancock took the turnpike. Griffin and Humphreys of Meade's corps went by the river road, each column preceded by a detachment of Pleasonton's cavalry. Sickles's corps, which had just arrived, was held in reserve. Any criticism of the operations of armies in this country would be unjust if we did not keep constantly in mind the nature of the ground. Except for rare clearings, the whole country in which Hooker now found himself was a dense and tangled forest, in every part of which the axeman had to be employed before the artillerist could be made available. Cavalry were for the most part of no use. The troops could not be seen by their officers. A regiment deployed as skirmishers disappeared from the sight of their colonel as if the earth had swallowed them. After half an hour's march through the thicket, the best equipped troops would reappear in rags and tatters. General Doubleday says it was worse than fighting in a dense fog. The frightful reverberation of battle among the trees was enough to appall the stoutest heart, yet a few hundred yards away nothing would be heard. The generals on either side, shut out from sight or from hearing, had to trust to the unyielding bravery of their men till couriers brought word which way the conflict was tending before they could send the needed support. It was through such a wilderness as this that Hooker advanced his army on the 1st of May. The enemy had, of course, to contend with the same difficulties, with this advantage on their side that they knew the by-roads of the whole region. But having advanced, there could be no question that Hooker should have continued as far as possible. Instead of doing this, he acted with unusual prudence and with something like hesitation. Sykes in the center met with some opposition from McLaws. Slocum was not abreast of him on his right, while Meade was too far away on the river road to connect with him. He therefore fell back upon Hancock, who pushed forward and checked the enemy. Now, if ever, was the need and justification for a great effort. Hooker was almost through the worst of the woods. Meade was nearly in sight of the important position of Banks's Ford, which was feebly defended. By pushing his forces resolutely forward on all three roads, General Hooker could have gained an advantageous position on open ground beyond. The troops were in fine spirits, says Humphreys, and we wanted to fight. We ought to have held our advanced position, says Hancock, and still kept pushing on. General Warren, chief of engineers, was of the same opinion. He urged Couch not to abandon his position without further orders. Couch asked for permission to remain, which was flatly refused, and the army fell back to the position near Chancellorsville, which they had left in the morning. This movement did not improve the spirits of the troops, and when Humphreys came back from the river road with his division, his keen soldierly eye recognized clearly the fault of the position. The army was drawn in too closely in every direction. It had not the look of an army ready for battle. They were in no confusion, he says, but they seemed to be unoccupied. The 1st of May thus passed without any progress having been made. The brilliant beginning of Hooker's campaign had not borne the fruit that was fairly to have been expected. Still, the position was a strong one, and with a few hours of work where it was most needed, the Army of the Potomac would have been safe from any attack the enemy was able to make. But unfortunately, the work was not done. The extreme right, under General Howard, commanding the 11th Corps, was absolutely unprotected. All his defensive works were in his immediate front. His right wing was in the air. This point of weakness in the Union line was discovered by General Stuart and made known to General Lee on the evening of the 1st. A flank attack upon the Federal right wing had always been his favorite maneuver, and the true and tried weapon with which he had so often succeeded was ready to his hand. He proposed to Stonewall Jackson that he should take his entire corps round to the right and rear of Hooker's army. Jackson entered into the plan with the greatest enthusiasm, and at early dawn on the morning of the 2nd he started upon this bold and perilous enterprise with 26,000 troops. He moved by a zigzag route southwest and then northwest across the Federal front, which in general faced south, leaving General Lee with a mere curtain of soldiers to occupy during his absence the attention of Hooker and his army. Jackson's movement, though hazardous, was not so desperate as it has been sometimes represented. Lee had been convinced the night before that it was impossible for him to carry Hooker's line by a direct attack in front. He had therefore resolved upon this flanking attempt as the only resource left him. In case of the repulse of Jackson, Lee considered that he still had his chance of retreat by the Richmond Railroad, and Jackson could with little difficulty have made his way back to Gordonsville, and with their rapid movements they could have reunited their columns by the Central Railroad. The flanking movement did not pass undetected. Jackson's column was seen in the early morning passing a hill in front of General Birney of Sickles's corps, who had been detached to fill the gap between Howard and Slocum. He immediately reported his discovery to General Hooker, who was unable at the moment to make up his mind whether it indicated an attack upon his right flank or a movement in retreat of the enemy. In fact, every act of his during those 3 days indicated a singular indecision entirely at variance with what was previously known of his character. Yet he does not deserve all the blame for the disaster of the 2nd of May, for immediately on receiving Birney's report, he sent an urgent order to Slocum and to Howard to examine their ground carefully and to take all possible measures against an attack in flank. He told them that the right of their line did not appear to be strong enough. No artificial defenses worth naming had been thrown up. They had not troops enough on their flank, and he thought they were not so favorably posted as might be. He had good reason to suppose that the enemy was moving to our right, and he concluded with an order to advance your pickets for purposes of observation as far as may be safe, in order to obtain timely information of their approach. With these urgent orders in his hands, supplemented by his own observation of the movement of a column of Confederate infantry westward, which he reported to Hooker about 11 o'clock, General Howard did little to guard against the coming danger. In view of the warnings he had received, he faced, it is true, 2 regiments to the west, but this amounted to the same as doing nothing. His pickets consisted of only 2 companies, and he had no grand guards to support them. Generals Devens and Schurz thought our right flank too much in the air, but Howard appeared to have a fixed idea that the attack of the enemy, if made at all, would be in his front, and he was confident of his ability to repulse any force that could come against him from that quarter. He waited, therefore, in perfect security until about 6 o'clock. At this hour his command, thinking the day was to go by without their participating in the battle, the noise of which they had heard fitfully rising and falling in the distance on their left, were quite at their ease. The soldiers were cooking their suppers, most of the regiments had stacked their arms, many were scattered under the trees playing cards, when all at once they were startled by a strange invasion. Deer, rabbits, and birds came leaping and flying in a panic through the thick brush towards them, and behind these came their scanty pickets and outposts, with Stonewall Jackson's Army Corps 3 lines deep at their heels. As soon as Birney had discovered the march of Jackson across his front, Sickles took Whipple's division to reinforce his left and proceeded, cutting and slashing his way through the hilly wilderness, to attack the flank of the force he saw moving before him. But by the time he reached Jackson's line of march, the greater part of his corps had passed on. There was some sharp and successful skirmishing with the rear guard. Jackson's trains were driven off to the road further south, and a considerable number of prisoners were taken by Sickles. He continually reported progress, and finding himself in such a favorable position to operate on either hand, he begged for orders to strike McLaws and Anderson on his left flank, or to proceed with reinforcements against Jackson's rear on his right. But as Lee had begun at this time a noisy demonstration upon Hooker's left to aid the attack of Jackson on the right, Hooker suffered for the second time that day from an attack of indecision, which had deplorable results. Before he had clearly made up his mind what to do, the 11th Corps was flying in panic in upon his center. The victorious troops of Jackson, inspired by a great success which had instantly cured all fatigue of the forced march of 15 miles, had taken in reverse the entire right flank of the army, and twilight was coming down on a scene of confusion and ruin. Then, as often before and since in the history of our war, it became the duty of subordinates, without orders, to rectify the errors of their superiors and to save the army from destruction. In the midst of the wreck and havoc created by Jackson's charge, several of the generals on the right, including General Howard, did their best to stay the incoming flood of the enemy, and the prominent officers who held the center of the field also kept their senses about them, and with admirable coolness and conduct executed what orders they were able to get. General Alfred Pleasonton of the cavalry had been sent to operate with Sickles in front, but when he reached him, finding the woods in that part of the field absolutely impassable, he started back, and at Hazel Grove a part of the 11th Corps passed him in full retreat. He had only 2 regiments of cavalry with him, but these and 22 guns of different batteries were very efficient. A gallant charge by the 8th Pennsylvania Cavalry under command of Major Pennock Huey, in which Major Peter Keenan and other officers were killed, checked for several minutes the advance of Jackson's corps. The 22 guns at Hazel Grove were brought into position and held their place with wonderful steadiness amid the confused rush of fugitives from the right. And as the right of Jackson's advancing lines emerged from the woods, they were received with a fire so intense and so well sustained that they made no further progress until nightfall. Sickles had been left in a critical position far in front of the rest of the Union line, with Jackson's corps on his right and rear. Guided only by the sound and the flash of Pleasonton's guns, he made his way back through the Wilderness, and afterwards by a gallant bayonet attack cleared the space to the turnpike. In this twilight fighting, the Confederates met with a personal loss equal to that of an army corps. In the impetuosity with which Jackson's corps attacked, their first line, commanded by Rhodes, became mixed and mingled with their second, commanded by Colston. The nature of the ground, broken up by dense thickets, still further disordered the line, and Jackson's own fury and ardor perhaps contributed to the confusion. He kept right up with his own advance, mingling his frequent cries of "Press forward" with short prayers of praise and thanksgiving, which he uttered with hand and face uplifted to the starlit sky. At last, perceiving that his lines were for the moment in hopeless disorder, he directed General A. P. Hill to divide his command, filing to the right and left of the highway to replace those of Rhodes and Colston, who were to be withdrawn to the second line. While this was being done, he rode forward in his unrestrainable impatience 100 yards beyond his line of battle. All at once he found himself under the fire of the Union guns. Turning to regain his lines, he was shot by his own men and mortally wounded. He died a few days later at Guiney's Station. General Hooker, somewhat shaken by the untoward course of things for the last 24 hours, and not appreciating fully the value of the position held by his troops at Hazel Grove, the center and key of the field, on the evening of the 2nd, had ordered his entire line to be withdrawn to a position nearer Chancellorsville. The damage incurred in the rout of the 11th Corps, great as it was, had been almost repaired before the morning of the 3rd by the readiness and energy of Pleasonton, Sickles, and Hiram G. Berry, who was killed in the afternoon of that day. The lines which they formed during the night, if held, would have ensured the safety of the army during the next day, especially as J. E. B. Stuart, who succeeded Jackson in command of his corps, abandoned Jackson's plan of turning the Federal right and occupying the fords, and devoted himself to desperate assaults directly in his front against the Union lines near the Chancellor House, and to establishing communication of his right with the left of Lee's army. All the morning of the 3rd, the officers in command suffered from great embarrassment on account of an unfortunate accident to General Hooker. As he was standing by his headquarters at Chancellor's House, a column of the portico was struck by a cannon shot and thrown violently against him. He fell senseless, and for some time was thought to have been fatally injured. He did not become conscious for half an hour, and for more than an hour longer he was incapable of giving any intelligent direction to the battle. General Couch was second in command, but under the circumstances naturally assumed as little responsibility as possible, and in the course of an hour or so General Hooker again resumed control. But valuable time had been lost, and he did not during the day fully recover from the effects of the shock he had received. The battle therefore lacked unity and energy from beginning to end, and although his troops fought well with steady and dogged courage, they could do nothing more under the circumstances than punish the enemy severely whenever they were attacked, and then fall back in pursuance of orders. By their last withdrawal they gave up their valuable position commanding the three roads to Fredericksburg, simply retaining an entrenched front towards the enemy, with both wings resting upon the river and covering their fords. General Hooker always severely blamed General Sedgwick for his part in the failure at Chancellorsville, and the Committee on the Conduct of the War adopted his opinion, visiting General Sedgwick in their report with severe and undeserved censure. At 9 o'clock at night, on the 2nd of May, Hooker sent a peremptory order to Sedgwick, directing him to march with the greatest expedition upon Chancellorsville, and to attack and destroy any force he might fall in with upon the road. Another order of the same purport was sent to him from General Butterfield, Chief of Staff, dated at midnight. It seems altogether unreasonable that Hooker should have expected Sedgwick to attack and defeat the force left at Fredericksburg, and then to march 11 miles and attack Lee's rear, and to do all this between midnight and daybreak. Yet this he claims to have expected, and this the Committee of Congress censured Sedgwick for not having done. It is true they induced several witnesses to say that if Sedgwick had accomplished this feat, the result would have been the destruction of Lee's army, a proposition which need not be discussed. But it is difficult to see how Sedgwick could have proceeded with more expedition than he really used. Getting his orders at midnight, he began operations against Fredericksburg as early as he could. He moved by the flank, fighting all the way. The head of his column at daylight forced its way into the town and to the front of the entrenchments at the heights beyond. He assaulted with 4 regiments, which were repulsed from the enemy's rifle pits. He attempted to turn the right of the enemy's position with a force under General Howe. He sent Gibbon's division to try to turn the enemy's left, and these efforts failing, he organized a strong storming party, which at last carried the enemy's center at the formidable point of Mary's Heights, which had proved so fatal to the army under Burnside. He did this at 11 o'clock in the morning. He seems to have delayed as little time as was possible to bring his troops into order again after the confusion of their assault and their victory. He then immediately put them in motion for Chancellorsville, meeting with some opposition all the way, until at Salem Church, little more than a third of the way to Hooker, the Confederates made a strong stand against him, having been heavily reinforced from Lee's main army. It is hard to see what more he could have done. He had taken Fredericksburg, had marched to Salem Church, fighting almost constantly from daylight until dark. If all the generals of the army had done their duty equally well on that and the previous day, we should have no further disaster to chronicle. He had also nearly all the fighting on the next day, the 4th of May. He gave and received about equal injury. The enemy had, of course, reoccupied Fredericksburg and came upon him from the east, west, and south. He applied to General Hooker for leave to cross the river and received it. This permission was afterwards countermanded, but these later orders were only received by him after his command had gained the north bank of the Rappahannock. Little was done by Hooker's army on the 4th. The disappointments of the 3 preceding days had greatly depressed him, and the physical injury which he had received on the 3rd left him still faint and feeble. So vacillating and purposeless was his action on the 4th that the usual calumnious report obtained credence that he was under the influence of liquor that day. Had he been in possession of all his faculties, he never could have left, as he did, 37,000 fresh troops out of the battle, who were waiting and willing to take part in it. The 1st and most of the 5th Corps stood idle on Hooker's right, forbidden to go in. So anxious was General Reynolds to bear his part that, in spite of his orders, he sent forward a brigade to make a reconnaissance, hoping that in this way an engagement might be brought on. But to his disappointment, the officers detailed to that service came back with only an excellent report and a lot of prisoners. Lee's army was left perfectly free to hammer Sedgwick at its will. On the night of the 4th, a council of war was called. Hooker, stating his views of the situation to his generals, retired and left them free to deliberate among themselves. Reynolds threw himself on a bed and went to sleep, saying he would vote with Meade. Meade, thinking the crossing would be too hazardous, voted to remain. So did Howard, who wished to give his corps a chance to redeem their reputation. Couch voted in favor of crossing the river. Sickles voted in the same sense. He afterwards gave as his justification for this vote that their rations had given out, that the rainstorm of Tuesday had turned the Rappahannock into a rapid and swollen torrent, and had carried away one of the bridges and threatened the rest. Besides, they had only supplies enough for one day more of fighting, and defeat would entail a great disaster. These were the views of General Hooker himself, and notwithstanding the majority of his corps commanders wished to stay and fight it out on the south side, he resolved to recross the river, and the movement was executed without further incident. His confusion and bewilderment lasted long after the battle. He said himself to the Committee of Congress, "When I returned from Chancellorsville, I felt that I had fought no battle. In fact, I had more men than I could use, and I fought no general battle for the reason that I could not get my men in position to do so. Probably not more than 3 or 3½ corps on the right were engaged in that fight." We need not recapitulate the fatal errors to which we have alluded to show that Hooker's reputation as a great commander could not possibly survive his defeat at Chancellorsville. Stonewall Jackson's bold and successful stroke on the Union right would not have prevented a great victory if a man of even ordinary capacity in great emergencies had been at the head of the army. He threw away his chances one by one. On the night of the 30th and on the morning of the 1st, a swift movement forward would have brought him clear of the forest with his left on Banks's Ford, and given him an enormous tactical advantage in the attack which Lee was forced to deliver. And even on the morning of the 3rd, by simply holding the position which Pleasonton, Sickles, and Berry had gained, with the help of the fresh 1st and 5th Corps on the right and the indomitable Hancock on the left, the enemy could probably have been repulsed. The successive withdrawals of Hooker's lines were a bitter mortification to his own troops and the subject of wonder and amazement to the enemy. The attempt to throw the blame of his failure upon Sedgwick was as futile as Burnside's effort to saddle his upon Franklin. The distrust and criticisms which had darkened the latter days of General Burnside's command of the army now gathered about his luckless successor. He had been the most outspoken and the most merciless of Burnside's critics, and the words of the President's severe admonition must have often come back to him when he felt himself exposed to the same measure which he had meted out to Burnside. The opinion which General Warren expressed to the Committee of Congress was that of most of the officers of high rank of the Army of the Potomac. A great many of the generals lost confidence in him. I must confess that, notwithstanding the friendly terms I was on with General Hooker, I somewhat lost confidence in him from that battle. Stoneman's expedition, although he started with the largest and most perfectly equipped cavalry corps which had ever been brought together upon the continent, accomplished very little. Instead of marching directly in a solid body upon Lee's line of communications, he divided his force into several parties of raiders, which spread wide alarm throughout the State, but did little serious and permanent damage. The losses at Chancellorsville were large on both sides. The Union loss was 1,606 killed, 9,762 wounded, and 5,919 missing, a total of 17,287. The rebel losses were 1,649 killed, 9,106 wounded, and 1,708 captured, in all 12,463. The proportion of loss to the troops engaged was thus about the same on the Confederate and on the Union side. End of chapter 4.